Well, hello, folks. Reverend Will from St. Barnabas Church here with you again for the latest episode of The Conversation. Joined, as always, by my co host, Onjalé Scott Price. So glad that you are with us for what is going to be something new for us. We've never done what we're going to do in this show. This is going to be part two of a conversation that we had last month. And we were thinking about what we should do this month, and we all kept coming back to we need to continue the conversation we had last month. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be talking about how to talk across the aisle, and we have a group of panelists who are going to return to us from being with us last month. And our on the street individuals have been kind enough to respond to two new questions from us to be part of the conversation today. So we're glad you're with us, and we'll be back in just a minute as we hear from these individuals on the street.
Let me not be disheartening in that I think most Americans and most people in general are extremely generous, and their efforts to help one another. But I don't know that at sort of the margins and in the tails of the distribution, whether there will always be that faction. There will always be those that have not been directed or understanding in the sense of walking in someone else's shoes.
There are people who want to know more, but they may not have access, or they may feel they don't. And I can actually believe when people say, I don't know how, or I don't know what to do. Well, simply being nice to people is a great start. However, you got to get outside of your circle. Do something to get outside of your immediate situation and find out what other Black people are like.
So I think probably religious institutions could play a good role in the sense that there needs to be more of a moral compass, I think, in terms of what is absolutely considerate of your fellow citizen, and how individuals fare better when they act in a collective manner that creates opportunity and equality across the entire population, more so than is the case now.
But there's so many more things that can be done on a smaller level instead of automatically having to attract national attention. Not everyone's going to be famous. There was one Martin Luther King, there was one Mahatma Gandhi. You know what I mean? So you don't have to make a video or call on a rap star or a politician to do what you can do.
Is it very important and that people can see that people of different political stripes can get together and perhaps diffuse the nasty rhetoric and the potential for violence if we can just take it down a little bit by showing that these two old dudes can get together?
Well, our folks on the street have given us something to think about and talk about. So we're going to begin the conversation with our returning guests. As I said in the opening, this is the first time we've done a part two of a show, but we just felt like we needed to continue this conversation. And friends, I have to say, if you've been paying attention, as I'm sure you as well as our viewers have been, I think we may have started something, because every place I look, people are talking about the need to have the conversation, the need to talk about this divide and bridging this divide. So lots of folks are copying us from Falmouth, Massachusetts, right? Just to refresh everyone's memory, we have with us Ewell Hopkins. Ewell lives on Martha's Vineyard. He was a candidate for state representative. He's involved in all kinds of community activities. And Ewell, we're grateful that you've joined us again. So welcome.
So happy to be here.
Thank you. We have Dr. Donna Jackson, a clinical psychologist, and who helped us really go deep in our last program in examining some aspects of this whole issue. And so we're grateful to you, Donna, for making the time to be with us. And Troy Clarkson is back, who is known to many, particularly in the Falmouth area. He's a former town committee member. He's has his own consulting firm and does strategic planning around government and helping people improve delivery of services. So, and is the mind behind Troy's take in the Falmouth enterprise. So thank you, Troy, as well for being with us. So we just heard from our folks on the street talking about what we can do to learn to walk in the shoes of others, and I'll just open it up and ask whoever feels ready to give us your thoughts.
I'll be happy to start. It's a thrill to be back, and thank everyone on the panel for continuing the conversation. Literally, one of the things that struck me as I watched those videos was a concept that I hear a lot about as someone in long-term recovery, and we have a phrase we call "identify, don't compare." And really, that was a thread that was woven through a lot of those comments, right? The suggestion or the plea even that we take time to understand others, even those of very divergent political views. I've actually interviewed and written about Paul Rifkin, one of the people on the street, many times. And recently, actually, I hosted a meeting with Paul and a fellow by the name of Adam Lang, who was the organizer of the Trump rallies at the Bourne Bridge. And you couldn't find two people with more divergent political views. And we can say whatever we want about their political views, but what they committed to doing as two human beings was sitting down, having a smoothie in a neutral location and finding some common ground. And they're both veterans, and they both lived in similar eras, and they were able to connect. And boy, that was a very powerful moment for me. And this was during the summertime, so it was in the height of the presidential campaign, where there was so much vitriol swirling all around us. And their ability, willingness to listen and identify with each other was a very, very powerful moment. And I would suggest not only for our conversation today, but for our collective wish to work towards a more perfect nation, that must be foundational. The ability to listen and identify with others.
Joy, let me just ask before we move on to hear what Ewell and or Donna have to say. Have you had any follow-up with either of them to see if they've maintained any connection and the communication with one another, or did they retreat to their separate corners, so to speak?
They have, and interestingly enough, they found a common purpose in a nonprofit organization that during the pandemic has provided meals to veterans. And so they've both made efforts to be engaged and involved in that organization, and have volunteered. In fact, Paul has sent me photos of their work together. And so that sort of thing, I think, transcends political philosophy. And I, by the way, I tried in that column that I wrote about that meeting, tried to transcend my own political views, because I have very strong feelings about some of the things that those rallies were promoting, and have some deep concerns about that. But recognize that unless and until we're willing to at least try to understand why somebody thinks the way they do, we're never going to get past the divide. And so I give credit to both of those people for being willing to demonstrate that that's possible.
Yeah, we talked a little bit in the last show about relationships. We talked a lot about relationships, and that being able to bridge this divide, to be able to walk in the shoes of another, really begins with a willingness to engage in relationship with someone. And I mentioned one of my favorite theologians, Martin Buber, and how he promotes exactly what happened that you were describing, Troy. You have to have a willingness to listen to the other. It begins with that. If you don't have that, then you can't do anything. And a former presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, used to say to clergy all the time when we were dealing with people in parishes where there's a lot of conflict, that a conversation begins with a willingness to be converted. You have to come to the conversation being willing to be converted. And if you don't come with that mindset, chances of any kind of success is limited. But let me ask you, Donna. So, what have you been thinking about since we were last together, and what might have sparked in you from what you saw from the people on the street this time?
Well, I was struck by what Ken said in terms of people. He believes most people are extremely generous, and I think that's a great place to begin, right? Is if you give someone the benefit of the doubt, and that you also know there's going to be smaller people on he's used fractions or outliers, anything, all of anything you can measure data falls onto a bell curve. So you're always going to get people on either end, but the majority of people fall in the middle. And so if you go into a conversation with the assumption that chances are high this person might, be in the majority of falling in that, larger part of the bell curve, and you can have a conversation with that person, you kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt of as an act of generosity, right? That they're capable of meeting you there. And then I think though empathy is a learned skill. So when you walk in someone else's shoes, it's a little phrase that we use to describe empathy. And, being in pretty much a business of, I have to use empathy a lot in the work I do, I'm always aware it's an approximation, and that I will never truly know what that person's experience is. And I have to be willing to be corrected, that if I think I know and I somehow reflect that back to them, they have the right to correct me. And then my job is to take in that correction so that I can learn. If I truly want to understand what their experience is, they have the right to correct me. And I have to be willing to then share the approximation I have and maybe make a mistake, right? And then recover from that mistake and be willing to learn. But I'm never going to truly know what it's like for someone else. And so, we use that a lot, and we use it really quickly, but it does mean you have to be able to tolerate that you might be uncomfortable and you might not know where the conversation is going. You might not really understand. And a lot of us aren't comfortable when we're not understanding something. We usually go into a conversation either to make our point and also to understand what the other person's saying and to be understood. So when that starts to break down, people start to get upset, frustrated, annoyed. So it's hard to really stay with the conversation if someone else's experience is really different from yours. How do you stay with that conversation? And empathy is something you have to practice. and be willing to have your own experience. Like Troy was saying, he's had his own thoughts and feelings about going into this meeting, and he had to be aware of that and not impose that during the conversation or while he was writing the article. So you have to be willing to know what your beliefs and your feelings are, but be able to suspend them a little bit so that you can really hear what the other person is telling you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Donna. Thank you. Much. It's reminding me of my training when I was being formed as a priest and in seminary and all. And one of the things they taught us is to strike from our vocabularies, that phrase that goes something like when you're talking to someone and they're sharing something maybe difficult with you, hard with you, about an illness, about a death or something, to say, oh, I know how you feel. Because you don't. You don't know how the person feels, right? But you're right. We're so quick to say that. Oh, I know how you feel. Well, do you really? Have you really walked in my shoes? Do you really know how I feel about something, right? So you're right. That has to be learned. So Ewell, good to have you back. As I said again, good to see you.
Thank you.
What's on your heart today as part of the conversation?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot since hearing the tapes and listening to both Troy and Donna now. The thing that stands out to me is separating oneself from a historical perspective, which is kind of saying what we've already said in a slightly different way. I'm pessimistic about the ability to appreciate and have empathy for people's legacy and the impact that legacy has on their being. What I'm optimistic about is our ability to, from this point, find common purpose and mutual respect and look forward. So what I mean by that is I'm almost at the point of giving up on trying to explain to a non-Black person what it's like to have been raised in this country as a Black person. It's just tiring and overwhelming. And anytime you think you're close, you're not really quite there. And I don't know what the purpose is, but what I do know is that if we don't come together, we won't succeed. We won't exist. I talked about the natural world earlier in the last session. I think the environment is a big part of bringing us together, the impact that we have on the environment. So I say looking forward versus trying to identify and understand the past is a start and something that I'm willing to invest in. In addition to that, I think it's ironic with this show, the conversation, I think we talk too much. I think I talk too much. I think we have to find common experiences that are nonverbal through music, through meditation, through being one in nature, listening to the sound of birds, not the sounds of our voices. Because I believe that the more common experiences that we create with one another, the more we'll find commonality. So I'm all about creating sacred space. I'm all about intentional coming together and creating experiences. When you listen to another person's music and you feel their love for that band or for that genre of music with them, where that may normally not have been your cup of tea, I think you get closer to that person. So maybe listen to some heavy metal if that is like the antithesis of what you think of as music with a metalhead, and just experience the music together. Don't try to talk to one another, just experience the music together and try to find some vibe there and then take that forward. So I'm all about, let's go forward together, because this whole thing of me kind of explaining to you where I'm coming from, I don't know, at 60 years old, I'm pretty much done with that.
You know, I'm remembering what I think it was Gina said in the on the street interview. She talked about the need to go someplace different, right?
Mhm.
Someplace different from where you that's normal for you. So you talk about the music. That's a brilliant example, right? So yeah, instead of always migrating to the music that soothes your soul, uh, think about listening to music that you might otherwise turn away from with someone who does have an appreciation for that,
Exactly.
and you may find commonality around something. But since you said we talk too much, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask Onjalé to join the conversation. What are you thinking about, Onjalé?
Well, I saw Donna had raised her hand for a moment. I know Donna wanted to say something along those lines before I make my comments that are slightly off topic.
Just that I think when you're, I think it's how do we remember the past because it's so important in terms of not repeating it. And at the same time, how do we move forward together? And so the next question, and we listen to the people on the street talk about how do you, they are related to each other, like the walk in someone else's shoes and how do you break out of your own bubble? They're kind of like the opposite sides of the same coin. Like we have to still be making some effort in doing things to break out of our own bubble and not just keep talking and talking. And I think including being with other people or opening ourselves up to other experiences, just like when you travel. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. There's an analogy about traveling for me that I thought was interesting to think about when you break out of your own bubble, but we're not quite there yet. I think though, in terms of empathy, um, and that's what we're talking about when you talk about walk in someone else's shoes. It implies that phrase, though, is you've already judged someone before you judge someone.
Hmm.
So I get concerned because the brain is trying to make predictions. That's its job. It makes predictions. Now we express predictions a lot of times in the form of judgments and usually dichotomous things. We're not very good at expressing them on a continuum or in grays. Things are right, wrong, good, bad, black, white. And so we get stuck in this dichotomous expression when our brain is just trying to make predictions, which is why bias is a problem. And, that the brain is inherently going to quickly bring in information and come up with a prediction, which is going to come out as a judgment. Be very outside of our awareness because it happens very quickly because the brain's dealing with all this information and it's trying to streamline it. So, and I want to talk later a little bit more about bias because empathy is great, but you're always going to have bias in with the empathy. And are you aware of that? So
Yeah.
Fascinating. The brain is absolutely fascinating. We think about how it works. So I'm thinking specifically about what Ewell said about not wanting or not being done with trying to explain yourself. I'm part of an NSF funded project called URGE, Unlearning Racism in Geoscience. And it's, long story short, it's a anti-racist program for geoscientists to join into pods and to read various papers about how the geosciences is racist and how that came to be and what we can do about it, actually creating policies and procedures for universities and for labs to follow so that they can become anti-racist. And it's interesting, our last week's session was about racism in history. So learning about why are the geosciences the least diverse STEM discipline? Why are we that way? How did we get to that point? And so there is an aspect of needing to talk about the past, even though like we know that there are so many scientists who were racist then. They weren't called racist then, but they were racist then, and their legacies live on, and we have their names on our streets and on our buildings, and we promote their legacy, and we're separating the person from the scientist, which is, so you're separating who the person was and what they believed and their science, but you can't actually do that. You have to see the whole person, that this person's racist views supported their science, or because of their views, they went a certain direction in their science. And so it's definitely, we want to move forward and we want to say, okay, we want to fix this, but without understanding where we were or how we got to this place, it's hard to move forward. But we're finding that it's difficult for people to even have those conversations about these racist scientists because they're just on this pedestal. And so when we try to bring up the history of, well, these are all the racist ideas they had, and this is how they colonized indigenous people in their science, in the name of science, you know, people have a really difficult time separating those things. So how do you move forward in a conversation that, no, rocks themselves are not inherently racist, but the way that rocks have been studied on indigenous lands without indigenous people, that is racist. So I said all that to say that I understand that it's frustrating and it's really annoying to have to continue to bring up the history, but it's really difficult for a lot of people to move forward without understanding how we got to that place in the first place.
Ewell, I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I totally connect in what I hear. I resonate with on so many levels. I agree. And what I believe is that we all have to figure out what our strengths are and how we can contribute, and then contribute that way. What I'm saying is I feel as though I have done a lot in my life to show the commonality of our humanity. And more specifically, I've done a lot to try to help white people feel comfortable in the presence of Black people and bridging that gap. And the results are far less than I would like to have been at this point. So what I have seen through my observation through my life is that we come together the best when we have a common focus, when we have a common priority, when we have to accomplish a common task. So my energy, I suspect, for the remainder of my life will be on creating that common perspective that we can take forward, because there's so much guilt associated with just the creation of this country. This country it's lunacy when you think about what it took to create this country. And when people talk about how proud they are of America, I understand that pride, but a lot of the pain is lost. It's the exploitation of humanity and of land and cheap labor to create wealth, generational wealth, was done on the back and through the lives of people who look like me. And we're not going to fix that. What we're going to have to do is try to find, a piece, a line in the sand that we can move forward from, because we're not going to go backwards. Reparations are not going to happen to any significant degree. Generational wealth will not be restored because there is so much unfounded wealth in our society that you don't want to really dig into how it was created, because it was created through such pain that those individuals will say, I wasn't involved in slavery. In the Northeast, we're so proud of how diverse and how progressive we are. It all started here. I mean, we're the culprits of so much pain in this country. And I just feel as though where others will look back, and I'm so encouraged that they will, my purpose is to try to find commonality and look forward, because I don't think we can fix the past.
Absolutely. And I personally feel like there are so many resources that are already out there. People who have wanted to tell their history and have wanted to explore that history have written books and blogs and have TV shows and podcasts. And so I do think that there are a lot of resources that people could tap into if they actually wanted to learn that. And people like you can use your spirit and your energy to do different things.
Yeah, thank you.
So this whole thing about moving forward is reminding me of something. I watched the new White House press secretary in one of her recent daily briefings. Amazing. We have daily White House briefings again. That's another story. but one of the things the reporters keep trying to get her to talk about the former administration, the former president, and sort of do this juxtaposition of what the current administration is trying to do versus what was done. And she keeps repeating something that I've also heard the current president say is that, I'm not looking back. We're not looking backwards. We are looking forward. That's where we're investing our energy. That's where we're investing our resources is what's coming, not looking at what was. And at the same time, yeah, those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it. I think someone once said, right? And so there's a need to know that history. But I'm like you, Ewell. I got to tell you, I'm tired, brother. I am tired. I mean, I am literally physically exhausted from it. And it's sometimes it takes all that I can muster to try to engage a person who is not a person of color, someone who is white, into another conversation about what it's like when the news reports that once again there's an example of that a black life doesn't matter. So we have the case of Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York, a mentally ill man naked in the streets in the cold, being handcuffed by police officers, thrown on the ground, forced to lie on the cold pavement, and then a spit hood put on him, and then he dies as a result of their action, and there's no accountability for that. The grand jury says, oh, there was nothing wrong with what happened there. And so when someone tried to engage me recently in a conversation about, oh, Will, what do you think about that? I just didn't have the energy. I didn't have that expression, new expression, the bandwidth. I just didn't have the bandwidth for it. I was like, it's just another example. That was about the only thing I could say. But let me move us to. I brought up government. I'm come to you. I wanted to come to you right now, Troy. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, but I think you raise an excellent point, and I think if we're going to have an honest conversation about this topic, I think that people who are not of color, people who look like me, need to be willing to remember that not every conversation you have with a person of color has to be about their color, right? So Will Mebane and I met, I don't know, several years ago now when he first came to Falmouth, and we've had, I don't know, dozens of conversations, and we've met for coffee many times. And what we share is our shared humanity, right? The only time I think, Will, that race ever became an issue in a discussion we had was when we talked about the fact that there's another guy that lives in Falmouth named Will Mebane, and he's white, but they're related. Right. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't look like you, who doesn't think like you, and not talk about what separates you or what divides you, and just exist together, right? And talk about, Will and I have talked about our faith, and or talk about our families, or we talk about recovery, or a whole host of things. And so I think if we're all willing to de-intensify the conversation a little bit and just exist with one another, and Ewell's right, and maybe just sit in quiet with one another, or listen to others. And I think it's important to acknowledge that does not ignore the horrific past that exists. It does not ignore that these very important public policy, racial issues exist in our society. But what it does mean is our shared humanity is as important, if not more so, than any of those issues singularly. And but by that, what I mean is our connections as human, to me, transcend, how much melatonin is in us, melanin, excuse me. So I think remembering that, and going back to the theme at the beginning of our visit today, being willing to listen and just be with others and try to just share some humanity, rather than sharing differences. is a good start. And that happens one relationship at a time, in one community at a time. And I think that's a good starting place for us.
Angie, I think I saw you and I saw Donna also. Yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Well, I think, go ahead, Angie, because I was,
Nope.
you sure? Okay. Well, so this is where it all gets tricky, right? I agree with you, Troy. And yet there's plenty of people who will say, I don't see color and I just want to see our shared humanity. And when they do that, they invalidate the toxic stress and trauma that people of color have experienced in our nation.
Absolutely.
So the language matters, like, and how you say it and when you say it and who says it and the kind of conversation you're having, the type of relationship you have with that person. And I think that that's where it gets tricky, and that people are, I think the next generation coming in may be a little less worn down, and let's hope they are, right? And they will have the energy, as young people do, to move things forward and to look forward and to continue to kind of create a more, they bring out the humane in our humanity, right? So that we're not having to have these conversations. And, we've gotten further in the last year with a lot of violence and protests, not the same thing, but the protests of the lack of attention to things that have been tolerated, and the language that, honestly, the damage that's been done over the last 4 years with the language that's been used. And, we're going to have, I do think healing means having more conversations, and not about who you are today, but, where you've come from and how you got to this moment, like our ancestral, all of everything everyone did, things that were wrong and brutal and things that were sacrificing and incredibly generous. I watched Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates, and I love watching it regardless of the person's race. When you watch someone of color trace their roots back, so you're going to hear a lot of trauma. And that's I think it's important for us to bear witness that we haven't fully borne witness to that brutality in order to have the kind of conversations where people can heal. And I think that show is a good place to do that. And Pharrell Williams was on recently, and he wrote that song Happy, which is a wonderful, upbeat song. But this is the first time ever in 5 years of that show being taped that they stopped the show and they let him leave, and they went back a few weeks later because Skip Gates was watching him struggle. Like, he was spending 4 minutes just staring off into space when he was hearing about his great-great-grandparents and what they went through. And I was in tears watching the show. It's, we desensitize ourselves to other people's humanity. That was Pharrell Williams learning about what his ancestors went through. And if you couldn't feel what that was like for him while you watched that show, this is around empathy. We're back to empathy again. Here's someone who writes this song Happy, and he's a successful American by all standards. And I think it was a really powerful moment for them to show that and go back and talk with him about what was happening. And what was happening was he was fighting his own emotional response to what looked like factual information. If you wanted to treat it like factual information, you could. But it wasn't factual information. These were his family members, right, who had sacrificed for him. So until we include the human stories and the emotions and I don't know how much further we can get with this.
Well, I haven't seen the show, and now I'm not sure I want to see it. No. One thing that has been said a few times is being worn down. I know Rev and I have had these conversations about being worn down. Ewell is Black, so I assume that at some point he is or has been worn down. And that's something that I'm a bit worried about for myself. Last year, 2020, I bought a bunch of books and I was like, I'm going to read these books. Now, the autobiography of Malcolm X, Medical Apartheid, Stamped from the Beginning, these books. And I got through a couple and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live my life being Black in a white community, working with white people every day, and then read this stuff. Like, that was supposed to be my downtime, but in my downtime, I was reading about my own history and history of this country, of my people, and what's the trauma, as we say. I couldn't function. I couldn't do anything. I had to find somewhere to take a break. And sometimes it's difficult to take a break within the community where I don't get a break, or if I am not hanging out with my husband who's Black, or hanging out with Reverend Will and his wife, like I don't have a space where I can just be. I mean, I have great friends, great white allies and mixed allies who are here, but it's not quite the same to not be able to just be. And so I don't remember what the original point I was going to make with that is, but
You made that point.
Okay, thank you.
No, you made the point, and it's so true. I'm not ashamed or disappointed that I'm worn down. I think it's wise for me to understand where I can contribute to the larger conversation. I wear my name as a badge of honor. I never lose sight of the fact that, being the third generation in my family that was born free, my grandfather, who I cared deeply about, was raised by a man who was owned by someone else until he was 20 years old. It's not theoretical at all, the whole idea that I was perceived as less than human in terms of my ancestors. But it's more complicated than that, because that slave was also a member of the Confederate Army. And the daughters of the Confederacy tend to his grave to this day. It's not as simple as the North was good and the South was bad. For Black folks, Emancipation Proclamation was a brilliant military maneuver to undermine the Confederacy, but it did nothing for the freedom of Blacks in northern states. I've never had this sense that, the Union was the answer and the Confederacy was the problem. It's so much more complicated than that. So I look at being a Black man in this society and I say, the most important thing you can do is figure out, and I think for all Black people, is to figure out what is rejuvenating, what gives you strength, what allows you to go forward, not what is depleting. There's enough places to be depleted on a daily basis. To your point, you have to find those places where you get stronger. And to me, it's really solace. It's really being alone. As public of a person I am, being by myself is really my secret weapon. There's a reason I live on an island. I wasn't born here. I intentionally came here and I've intentionally stayed here. We have to find those things. And I understand what you say about those books. I mean, sometimes you just got to put it down and then go do what you can do. And I'll leave the historical proportions to others. And I love your comment when you say that the data, the information is out there for the seeking spirit. The person who truly wants to understand how the Transcontinental Railroad was created doesn't have to wonder too long, and they don't have to go find some Asian Americans to get the answer. They can learn if they truly want to learn. So I don't have to be the teacher anymore. And I've decided not to be the teacher. I've been the teacher too long.
Well, we're going to move to the second question, and a couple of comments before we do that. Just when Donna, you were talking about the generations and how the hope is in the younger generations, the generations that will come after Ewell's and my generation. You know, boy, I've been hearing that for so long, and my father's father said to him, things are going to be better for you. And then my father had the hopes for my brothers and my sister and me that things are going to be different for you. You're not going to have to deal with this. And then my spouse and I have two sons, and we thought it's going to be different for them. They're not, and it's not, and it's not, and it's not. And so that, one of the reasons that maybe that's one of the reasons the AMA decided that racism causes black folks to have PTSD. And it really does take years off of our lives. So I want to get to Donna wanted to talk about bias, but why don't we first take a listen to our people on the street and see what they had to say in response to our second question, which was, how do we break out of our own bubbles? All right, we'll be back right after this.
To get out of your bubble, I think I'd mentioned something before about actually going into other environments, somewhere that's outside of your own immediate space. That may sound like a lot, but just something simple, like maybe find a coffee shop in a neighborhood you don't normally go to, or if it's warm weather, go to a park in an area you don't go to. Just literally, if you may have to get outside of your comfort zone, but not something forced, like a drive or something contrived to draw people. It's got to be something that people want to do. And that's hard because we tend to want legislation and regulation, but a lot of the things that may need to be done, or some of them are small enough to where we can just do them and not have to worry about organizing, so to speak.
Certainly the news cycle doesn't necessarily aid in providing a narrative that might be enlightening, particularly from some aspects of sort of partisan dissemination.
I will watch people post things that just aren't true about both sides. And then people don't bother to research it whatsoever. They just see it on the Instagram post. They read the surface level text on the square, and they just go with that. And even the wording in general news articles, it's like if you look at it in an unbiased sense as, oh, I walked into this place, what is going on? Like, you don't know, if you didn't know there was like an election, all this stuff happening, and you just walked in, what is going on? You could read those headlines and be like, oh, they're biased. For most of the websites, you could read those websites and be like, oh, they're sarcastic, they're biased. And it's just, people will just read the headline. They won't read the article. And even if they clarify in the article, the headline, which is meant to get people to read it, doesn't work. They just read it and be like, oh, so that's what's happening now.
That partisanship, thinking that I'm right, you're bad, that's not going to make us move forward. We need to talk to each other. We need to listen to each other. We need to respect each other, and we need to work together in order to make our society work.
Well, once again, our people on the street have given us things to think about and to talk about. So we're going to continue the conversation specifically around, what do we do? What can we do to get out of our bubbles? And I'm going to come to you, Donna, because you had some thoughts, I think, earlier about that. So share with us what's on your mind.
Sure. Well, I think, Gina was saying it doesn't have to be something big. It can be small, which I think is a great, that way you can't make excuses that you can't do these other big, grander kind of plans. It can be very simple and small. And so, you know, I think it's just setting your intentionally doing that. It does require effort. And so if it's putting your values into action, if it's something you value, that's easy to say in words, but your values usually are more evident in your behavior, right? That's how you know someone's values, not in their words. And so you do have to look at, are you putting the effort, the intention, and then the effort into changing your behavior? And so, you know, I think that means it's sort of like you have to tolerate that maybe you'll be a little uncomfortable. There might be a little bit of distress because it's going to be new to you. It's not going to be your old familiar thing that you do. So, you know, when you go on a trip, whenever I go on a trip, I'm excited, but I also am a little stressed, right? You have to pack, you have to go, and you're a little uncomfortable on the airplane, and you get somewhere and you have a little bit of jet lag. And that's all part of going on the trip. You know, you take it in stride as you travel, and that's what it's going to be like. But we don't always, that's not how we approach going outside of our own bubble. Like, we don't see it that it's going to take maybe a little bit of effort on our end. And then, you know, that we'll, by doing that, you know, what might we take away from it? Like, what's the purpose of why we're doing that? You know, hopefully it's to live our values, and it's also to learn, you know, and maybe it's to do something different, you know, something so that you are continuing to grow and learn. And, you know, but a lot of times when we travel, like, I have to think there are people who do have ulterior motives. Like, are they just doing it to be part of the woke culture, right? To wear the t-shirt. I'm a little concerned about the marketing. Talk about, there is so many t-shirts and other things coming out. Oh my gosh. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's people are going to start making money off of this? Like, it's, I don't know, that was been a little upsetting lately to see. But like at Target, I'm serious, like mainstream availability. But, and when you travel, like, it's not about wearing the t-shirt. I mean, you take the t-shirt home, but if you live on Cape Cod, you generally don't wear Cape Cod t-shirts very often, right? So I think just that if you're going outside your bubble, to really, it does mean a little more than just you showed up once or you checked off a box. I mean, you can travel that way. You can have a bucket list, and it can just be impression management. You check off the box, you're able to have bragging rights. But is that really why you traveled? If that's the only reason you traveled, I'm not sure what you got out of that, you know? So when you're going outside your bubble, you know, hopefully you're aware of why you're doing it, or, you know, you're doing it with intention.
I'd also like to add, that's a really great analogy about travel, is when you're traveling to somewhere you've never been before, you generally do a little bit of research before you go. You don't just go in blind. I was once with a great white friend of mine who went to an HBCU, and he found this nice area of land with a bunch of benches, and he went and sat down, and we were like, you can't sit there. He's like, well, why not? It's a bench. I'm like, because that is the Greek plots. That is where the Greeks have their plots. And if you are not part of that fraternity or sorority, you can't sit there. And he really didn't know. And it was very, very genuine, but it's like part of that analogy of, like, if he had asked, like, oh, what are all of these different color things here that I've never seen before, instead of just seeing it as a bench, you know, that wouldn't have, it wasn't a big deal. But the point is, when you're traveling somewhere, especially somewhere you've never been before, you do some research. You don't just go in blind and assume that whatever you're normally accustomed to is what is going to be normal or acceptable there. Like, we were planning a trip to the UAE last year that COVID canceled, but we were thinking, okay, what do I have to wear? What is appropriate for me to wear while I'm there? I know I can't wear certain things, or I shouldn't if I want to be appropriate. And so when we're thinking about going outside of our bubbles, is what is there? What research can I do to prepare myself to be appropriate, to be respectful before I get there, instead of getting there and, I don't know, something bad happening?
Well, this conversation about travel is reminding me of something I've noticed when we've had the opportunity, the privilege, and the good fortune to be able to travel Uh, sometimes people bring their bubbles with them. If you've ever gone on a cruise, which we like to do, boy, you would think folks just demand that things just be the same way they are back in Falmouth, or Kentucky or Louisville or whatever. We like to get off the beaten path, and we like to find out where the local yokels hang out. And sometimes it can be a little dangerous to go off the beaten path, but that's where we want to be, to try to do the education, to get outside of the bubble and do the self-education that we're talking about. But Ewell, Troy, what's on your mind?
So I think that in many ways over the last generation, technology has expanded our horizons, right? Almost limitlessly, beyond our imaginations pre-internet. But it also has hardened our bubbles and made them so much smaller. And one of the challenges for us is from an electronic social media internet standpoint, remembering that many of us exist within our own social media and internet silos. And part of getting out of the bubble is not only realizing that there's information of tremendous sources, but that we have an obligation to exist outside of those internet and social media bubbles. And Reverend Will, when you were talking about the way you and your spouse travel, I would equate that to curiosity, right? And it's okay to have curiosity and not simply be content with our bubbles and how we exist and with whom we exist. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, to be willing to step outside of that in our typical routines and our comfort zones and our Twitter feeds and the Facebook groups to which we will belong, and seek out information and try to learn and understand and listen. And listening isn't just with the ears; it can be with the eyes too, right? Reading and understanding different cultures and different points of view. I mentioned during the break that my wife and I going on vacation, and one of the places we regularly visit is St. Martin because we have a timeshare there. But one of the things I love about it is the island is divided between the Dutch side and the French side. And we stay on the Dutch side, but I love to go to the French side because I want to learn and understand how they're different and how differently they're governed. And meet people, from the island. And so I think that sort of example is a challenge for all of us to be willing to visit the French side of the island in our own lives, and seek out information that may make us uncomfortable, but that probably makes us broader and hopefully more tolerant.
Ewell, I saw you were going to get in on this.
Oh, yeah, sure. Slightly different, but in the same vein of travel. So much of my awareness and discovery outside of my bubble is introspective, and it's self-perception. I was raised in an environment, in a binary environment around gender, as an example. You were a man or you were a woman, boy or a girl. The whole idea of gender being a continuum, and what that really means to an individual that finds themselves somewhere in the spectrum, not at either extreme, or is fluid and is moving, is something that has been uncomfortable for me at times, but yet very important for me to understand and try to embrace. So moving outside of my bubble is a self-awareness of what is it that society is inflicting upon you as you define who you are, and what is really resonating from within you. And what happens when we give and create a caring enough environment that the manifestations of the individuals are truly from within versus imposed upon from without. So I through solidarity, publicize my preferred pronouns now. That's new to me. But that's very important to me, because I want to create an environment for individuals to truly listen to themselves and not what we're telling them they should hear. I am, we talked earlier, very involved in town government, and I am the chair of the planning board. And I put a lot of work into the planning board for a couple of reasons, but one main reason is I want to create a nurturing enough environment that we collectively can define where we're going as a community, versus it happening externally through developers or other self-interest, to be able to say, what is it that our community values, that we want to preserve, that we want to encourage? I laughed when Troy talked about, people coming, and I would say coming and bringing their reality to situations. I mean, I always say, if you're on the vineyard and you're rushing down the road, you have only two places on the island where that's legitimate. One is heading to the boat when boats are going, we'll give you a little slack, and the other is getting to the hospital. Anywhere else, chill out. You don't have to rush. You don't have to pass. You don't have to go fast. It'll be there. Just chill out. So I have no patience for people who are rushing away from the hospital and the boat, because I say there's nothing you have to get to. I say all of that because so much of our perception of how we feel comes from within. And if we create an environment where we allow the individual, whether it be in terms of self-reflection or in behavior, truly figure out why they're jacked or not jacked, we're a better society. So my answer is that introspective view, creating a nurturing and purposeful enough environment that people can hear themselves, quiet the noise down enough for people to hear themselves.
That introspection, that work on self-reflection and self-awareness, it reminds me of something. One of the, I think it was Ken who said that religion can play a role in this. Religious institutions can play a role in this to help develop what he described as the moral compass. The moral compass. And I actually preached on this just a couple of weeks ago in the season of Lent, and I tried to make the point that Lent is a time for introspection, reflection on oneself, and slowing down, as you were saying, Ewell. And Ronnie, my spouse, said when we had been on the Cape maybe 2 or 3 months, she said, "You know what? I think we're going to live longer." And I was like, "What? Why?" And she said, "Things aren't as fast paced here as every place else we've been, in Cleveland and Buffalo and Connecticut." She said, "I think we're going to live longer," right? So there's something to slowing down. You're right. You're right. Well, we got a couple of minutes left. Anyone have anything they'd like to make sure they share before we end this conversation?
I think for me, I just would want to talk a little bit about that introspection and the self-awareness. And hopefully that there's a lot more of that happening with the mindfulness movement, that is getting more mainstreamed. And the one thing, and hopefully I think people start to learn more about how our brains work, because it's relevant to understanding then how we react. And I also would like people to know maybe a little more about trauma, and the impact of trauma on humans. There's things that you are going to see when people have been traumatized. We already know some of those symptoms that happen to people, and then how to help them heal. And unfortunately, as we've become, it's about a sense of healing within a community, and that's the part that we don't quite have right now, is how to be a community and how to heal in community. And I do think part of healing, though, is having witnesses and bearing witness to that means, and also that has to be in a safe community. So that has to be where you feel welcomed and understood, and you can listen to your own sense of self that's true to you, and you can express that safely. And so, we're, hopefully are some places we're doing that. And, whether that's on an island like Martha's Vineyard, or, whether that's within faith communities, or, I think everyone doing their part, though, in each of our own individual, what we do for work. I think changing those communities, our work communities, our families, how are we talking to each other in our families? And those are all ways that we can continue, I think, to be honest with ourselves, and to be there for each other, and to really focus on being in the world in our human kindness. Like, what does that mean? What's our legacy? What are we leaving for our children, for the next generation? And I hope we can all agree upon, we want to leave them a healthy, safe planet and community. So there's that looking forward, right? Which,
Well, there's common ground, I know, between Ewell and you, and I presume all of us around the environment, that we do need to reconnect and develop a deeper appreciation for the environment. And maybe that's the thing, amongst all the noise and there are so many other challenges out there, maybe that's one area where we can find that common ground. We can change our language, and we can do the teaching to our family members and those who come behind us. We're trying to do our part here with this show, The Conversation. Thank you. I can't say it enough. Thank you, Troy Clarkson. Thank you, Ewell Hopkins. Thank you, Dr. Donna Jackson. I'm feeling like we could keep this conversation going for even another episode. So we thank you for coming back and being part of this part 2, as we wrestle with how do we bridge the divide, how do we talk across the aisle, how do we walk in the shoes of the other, how do we get out of our bubbles. My thanks to FCTV, to Deborah Rogers and Alan Russell and Tony Sidara and all the people behind the scenes that make this show possible, and especially to my co-host and friend Onjalé Scott Price. Can't wait to get you back to the house, Onjalé. We'll do that soon.
Looking forward to it like you wouldn't believe.
But that's our show for this episode. Thank you. Don't forget, we might make you part of the conversation at some point as well.